Chers amis dans le Dharma, dear friends in the Dharma. Yes, as Vajragupta said, I first met the Dharma and the Triratna Buddhist order as a student in Bristol at the age of 19. And I very quickly realised that I had found my spiritual path and my spiritual family. I became a mitra just after my 21st birthday, and I asked for ordination soon after that. It took a little while to get ordained, but that's another story. Visiting India just after leaving university and spending time in Bodh Gaya, I knew that I really wanted to teach the Dharma. Interestingly enough, we met a monk there who read my palm and who told me that I would do that and that I would do it in a country that wasn't my own. Actually, I think he might have been a little bit in love with me and hoped that I'd go back to India. Anyway, be that as it may, a few years later I met a very lovely Frenchman and rekindled my schoolgirl French. And at Sangadevi's suggestion, I got in touch with Varadakani, who was at that time beginning to set up or to move towards setting up activities in Paris. And it soon became clear to me, partly because of the relationship that developed with Varadakani, that I would one day move to Paris and help her to run the centre there. So I've now been living in Paris with the lovely Frenchman, who's now Ujjumani, for nearly 11 years. My interest in attaining insight also has its roots in the early days of my involvement, and I have very fond memories of striding across the downs in Bristol with Tejananda, talking passionately about the importance of gaining stream entry. I think I was very much on fire with the Dharma in those days, and I hope I still am. But I can't say that I've ever specifically thought about spreading the Dharma as a path to insight. That certainly was not and is not my motivation for choosing to do so. I teach the Dharma in Paris because I see how desperately the world needs it, because I believe it to be the only true response to the suffering that I witness around me. Nevertheless, that question as to what extent doing so has led towards insight is a pertinent one for me personally. And one thing I can say with certainty is that the last 10 years or so in Paris have changed me greatly. I have grown in many ways, and I think I can say with confidence that I have grown in wisdom, at least on a certain level. If I ask myself what has led to that process of change and growth, probably the word that sums it up would be challenge. Interestingly enough, Vajragupta used that word also earlier. My time in Paris has been challenging. And I'd like to just mention some of those challenges. So there's the challenge of learning to express myself in a new language and of encountering and negotiating a new culture. There's that frustrating experience of not feeling quite satisfied that I've been fully seen and understood, because my vocabulary and my command of grammar at the time didn't allow me to express myself as fluently in French as I could in English. And it's really quite frustrating to feel that one's only showing bits of oneself, the bits that fit into one's vocabulary. And then there's that unnerving experience of not being sure that I had fully understood what others were saying, especially in the domain of feelings and emotions, where the use of idiomatic language tends to increase. I don't know if you've noticed that, but if you move into another culture, you do. And I remember conversations with Mani Badri, who's a very passionate and emotional person who would be pouring out her heart to me, often in tears. And these idioms would just flow out, and I would be there, and I didn't know whether I really understood what she was saying or not, and I was sort of grasping up straws, but I couldn't interrupt the flow to say, what do you mean by? But we're still very good friends, and I've gradually learned, and some of those idioms have found their way into my own vocabulary. But it really was quite unnerving to be in that position. And then there's that underlying feeling of unease that's just there, sort of most of the time, because I could never be quite sure that I'd got it right. There's so much that goes on in communication between human beings, that happens largely unconsciously and on the basis of implicit, shared cultural norms and assumptions. And when you don't have those, actually you're quite a lot of the time on slightly shifting sands. Then there was the challenge of learning how to communicate the Dharma in a new and very different culture. The question of language to start with, and finding satisfactory equivalents of the terms that I'd learned in English. And one actually very crucial one is mindfulness. In fact, even our translation of the word mindfulness has been evolving since I've been in Paris, as we've begun to see more subtleties of how it can be better expressed in French. And interestingly enough, now that CBT, whatever it's called, mindfulness-based approaches are starting to reach France a bit later than they have over here, they're simply talking about mindfulness. And then there's the fact, this one really hit me, the fact that the resources in terms of text, both Bhante's works and traditional texts that I'd come to rely on for puja readings, for quotes in talks, for teaching, that exist in English don't necessarily exist in French. And one huge example was the Pali Canon. When I moved over there were only a handful of suttas translated from the Pali Canon. That's changed now, thankfully. And then gradually realizing that I was speaking to people whose basic worldview was very different from mine, and very different from the one that prevailed in the culture in which our Triratna Dharma has developed. Despite the narrow strip of water that separates us, France is surprisingly different from England culturally. And when I was discussing this with Ujimani beforehand, we realized that for a people whose motto is liberté, égalité, fraternité, the French are highly normative, deeply hierarchical, and exasperatingly individualistic. And actually, when you're trying to establish a Sangha that is based on community, on a sense of Kalyana Mitrata that isn't about the guru and the disciple, all those things that are natural to us, at least those of us who've grown up in Britain, actually it's quite difficult to get that across sometimes. And then, of course, there's a necessity just of being as clear as one possibly can about what one's trying to teach, which applies to us all. Knowing it as deeply as possible. All those of us who teach the Dharma will know that. But having to translate what one teaches into a new language certainly shows up areas of unclarity. And my previous training as an interpreter, has taught me that to translate one really needs to understand meaning. And so there's no question of just falling back on well-worn phrases lifted directly from the pages of Bhante's books. I've been really challenged to continually deepen my understanding of the Dharma. And then there are the challenges associated with working in a small, new, isolated situation. There was the challenge of building working relationships at the time with Varadaki and Suvanavira. When there are so few of you, you can't just do a class on a different night or avoid each other. We had to really find ways of working together. And then after they left Paris, there was the challenge of taking on the responsibility for a geographically and linguistically isolated Buddhist centre as a lone order member, without a chapter, and far from my close friends in the order. And actually it was only when, it amuses me to say, it's only when Ujimani was ordained and Mani Badri and Ujimani and Jayamuni and I set up a chapter that I really started to feel fully like an order member again in Paris. And I really understood that aphorism of Bhante's that an order member without a chapter is only half an order member, because actually not being in relation to other order members in front of the Sangha, so to speak, I was just an isolated, unusual being that was different from the Sangha but didn't have any peers around me. And then there's the challenge of trying to communicate and inspire the practice of Sangha in a situation where there were not enough of us to exemplify it, and no other Sanghas near enough to help give an example of Sangha. That also is not to be underestimated. And then finally, the challenge of working with very limited resources in terms of space and order members. and the pain, real pain of having to turn away people who wanted to discover the Dharma because we just don't have enough resources. I've been very fortunate in that I have not had to deal with the challenge of earning a living, worrying about having enough money, a place to live, health insurance, dealing with French bureaucracy. And for that, I personally and the Buddhist Centre owe a huge debt of gratitude to Ujjimani, who also deserves a portion of the credit for my current fluency in French. So one could say that in some way or another, I would say all those challenges, each of those challenges is ultimately a challenge to my view of myself and who I am. So I'd just like to give a few examples. The view I can was challenged, as all sorts of things that were easy for me in England became difficult in France. The view I know, which some of you will know is one that's quite strong, was challenged as suddenly there were so many things I did not know, from things as basic as to where to buy shampoo or how to write a cheque, through to how to communicate with people. For example, negotiating the French use of vous and tu. The view I am better than others was challenged, as I found myself suddenly incompetent or in difficulty with things that those around me did easily and naturally, including communication. And the view I can't was challenged, as often there was no one else available. So if I wanted something to happen, I had to do it myself. I had to just get over that view and get on with it, including things that I didn't particularly like doing or didn't feel that I did naturally. And then the view I'll never be good enough, which has followed me all my life, was challenged as I began to see that even if my efforts were often flawed, they were having a positive effect and people did appreciate what I was doing. And in a way the ultimate reward for that has been seeing Sadhamani join the order this year. So any idea that I had I was in control was severely challenged, not only by my limitations with regard to the language and the culture, but also by the rapidly evolving situation in the Buddhist Centre. For those of you who've been reading Shabda all this time, you will have followed the story. And then more globally, just all sorts of ideas and assumptions I had about people, about life, about the world, the way the world works, all those were challenged. I just wanted to give you two examples. One was the area of punctuality. I remember I started doing a group with the Mitras, I think it was, and the class would start at 8 o'clock, I think, something like that. So let's say 8 o'clock. And maybe at about 2 minutes to 8 or 8 o'clock, people would start to arrive. And after a few weeks of feeling actually quite hurt by this, I started to talk with them about it. And I said, do you really value this session that we have together? Is it important to you? Because you're not arriving on time. But the class starts at 8 and we're arriving at 8. And I just had to accept that. So I just had to realise that actually it was okay. It wasn't about me. It was just their habits. So we've started moving the classes forward a little bit. And we start with a tea break now. Half an hour's tea break. And the other one was the way in which one can communicate in those kind of situations. I remember running a beginner's class, and Mani Badri, who was a Mitra at the time, was supporting me. And suddenly in the middle of the class, Mani Badri started having a very intense, what looked like a ding-dong, really, a sort of discussion back and forth with this woman who'd only come to the centre for the second or third time. And I was thinking, oh my goodness. But it was absolutely fine. And at the end of the evening, they kissed each other goodbye, as you do, and on both cheeks, and everything was fine. I said to Mani Badri, but was that all right? What are you talking about? And actually, that has been a real liberation for me. It's been a very pleasant discovery, that actually we can have very direct, almost confrontations, without it being taken personally. It's very liberating. Come to Paris. So, and then I think I must conclude that all these and many other challenges, I won't list them all, have had the effect of loosening my fixed and limited view of myself. Inevitably, I've had to keep changing. I've had to change again and again, reach my limits, go beyond them, find a new way of expressing myself or of being or responding. And through this experience, my faith in the Dharma has deepened and strengthened. and my heart has been warmed by those magical moments where the Dharma just seems to communicate itself through me, and by the joy of seeing people responding to it and blossoming before my eyes. And as the world around me appears to become ever more intensely prone to suffering, I am more convinced than ever that what I'm doing is the best response I can offer. But is that insight? It certainly feels like spiritual death, and it is strongly imbued with a vision of at least the first two of the three lakshanas, impermanence and unsatisfactoriness. In terms of the third lakshana, however, I started to have a sense that much as my self-view was loosening and evolving, it was still very much a self-view. In fact, indeed, I felt I was in danger of simply becoming an ever more competent chairwoman and Dharma teacher with a growing mastery of the French language and culture. I was in danger of becoming quite proud of myself in some ways. So last year, I also started to feel a bit encumbered by the self that was reflected back to me by the people who attended the centre. I started to feel a bit limited by the assumptions and expectations that they appeared to hold concerning that self. And then situations began to occur in which I felt unable to respond from a deep enough level of vision and insight. It seemed to me that all that evolution that I experienced so far, though very positive, and I'm sure it had led me to this point, was not quite enough and not quite on the right level somehow. Deep down, I felt something was lacking. And my conclusion was that the path of responsibility, the outward-looking path of communicating the Dharma, needed, in my case at least, to be balanced by the path of the inner life. I do find that the more activity I'm engaged in, and the more my mind is occupied with problem solving and planning, the more difficult it is for me to enter deeply into meditation. It even becomes difficult for me just to stop and do nothing, or to read, or to reflect. And I'd got a bit stuck in my role and its associated activity. So it became evident that if I wanted to not just to evolve and refine my sense of self, but to penetrate its illusory nature, I needed to stop turning outwards for a while and turn inwards. I wanted to work more directly on insight. As many of you will know, and as Vajragupta has just said, I'm now currently taking a year away from the centre. And now you'll understand a little bit more why. I've been slowly weaning myself off all the activity and the tendency towards responsibility, and gradually turning inwards, looking deeper. But that is a story I shall have to tell on another occasion.